Hi there guys, and welcome back to the final chapter of Measle and the Wrathmonk by Ian Ogilvy, illustrated by Chris Mould and published by Oxford University Press. So where we'd left off in the previous chapter, Measle had managed to get rid of Basil. Measle's plan was that by hitting the cockroach with the train set, that it would knock the cockroach off the tabletop and they'd be safe from it, right? But in actual fact, what happened was, when the train hit the cockroach, it sent it up into the air, and Cuddlebug the bat swooped down, grabbed it, and flew out the attic window. But when it done that, the cockroach turned back into Basil because the spell wore off. And then what happened was, Basil and Cuddlebug the bat fell out the sky and hit the floor with a splat. No more Basil. And with Basil gone, that meant that the spell that was cast on Measle and the rest of the victims was starting to wear off. Because if you remember, Tinker started licking Measle's face and Tinker was starting to get bigger. So let's find out what that means. Pretty sure I know what it means, but this is the final chapter, remember. Are we going to get a happy ending with this book? Let's find out. This is chapter 10, The Fall of the House of Tramplebone. And look, there's the big nasty house. And remember the little rain cloud that always rained on top of the house? See that? Wonder what that's for. Anyway, might never know. Measle could see that Tinker was getting bigger because of the way that the surrounding scenery seemed to be shrinking. Where moments before the nearby trees had loomed over large over the dog, now Tinker was half their height. His body now straddled all the way across the railway tracks, which seemed to be getting smaller and smaller. And yet, Tinker didn't seem to be getting bigger in relation to him, which meant he was growing too. He glanced about him. Yes, his head was now higher than the trees and he could look out over the forest. He could see the entire tabletop. And over there, the control box, looking as if it was lifting itself clear off the surface of the table. He watched as the screws holding the box down to the plywood sheets were wrenched out of their holes with the sound of tearing wood. And then, with a pop, the box was thrown to one side and he could see a very squished looking group of people crawling out from its shadow. And they were growing, and growing fast. And now his own arm brushed against the forest and 30 trees were demolished. He sat up quickly and felt the table wobble beneath him. He heard the creak as its weight increased, and he saw Tinker suddenly stagger as the table shifted, then move away from him and jump towards the attic wall, landing with a thump on the floor beneath. He looked again towards the group of people, and they were close now, just a metre away. And Frank and Kip were grinning, and Lady Grant, still clutching her precious shoe, had tears running down her face. And William and Kitty and Prudence were jumping up and down and hugging each other, which was a bad idea because, with that and all their combined and rapidly increasing weights, the trestles supporting the great tabletop suddenly gave way and the whole vast expanse of plywood pancaked down to the floor with a great dusty crash. It was lucky that Tinker was so agile. He had been sniffing around under the table at some tiny fragments of sawdust, some of which smelt like the smelly boy and some of which smelt like the little girl and all of which smelt like those metal things in the men's tool bags. And he'd heard a creaking sound over his head and had looked up just in time to see the plywood sheets sagging down towards him. He jumped out the way just as the tabletop smashed down onto the very spot where he'd been standing. And now, after all that excitement, there was the smelly boy sitting in the ruins of the train set looking a bit dazed but otherwise fine. So Tinker trotted up and gave him a quick lick, partly out of friendship, but mostly because he tasted quite good. And there, also sitting in a pile of wrecked miniature houses, were his dear old lady, rubbing her hip with one hand and picking bits of plaster out of her hair with the other. And she deserved a lick too, as did all the other people, all of whom seemed a little dazed and confused, but that was all right, because the surroundings had certainly changed dramatically, and as far as Tinker was concerned, certainly for the better. Measle began to crawl through the wreckage towards the group, but something seemed to be in his way. A rectangular block of stone, which hadn't been there a moment before, was suddenly blocking his view. He stood up, his feet crushing the entire logging camp, and began to walk around the block, but the block was getting bigger, expanding in all directions, left, right and upwards, and Measle looked up and saw that it was the statue from the town square. Already the figure of the man and the woman were high above his head, just as they had both been when the statue had been tiny. He looked around to see if anything else from the train set was growing, but no, it was just the statue on its stone base, rearing up now towards the rafters. And then there was an ominous creaking of straining floorboards. On the other side of the statue, Kip was scrambling to his feet. He hauled Prudence up and onto hers and shouted, "Quick, everybody! The floor won't take the weight! We've got to get out of here!" Measle met them all at the attic door. "What's happening?" he shouted over the creaking sound of protesting timbers. "I don't know," yelled Kip, "but I do know wood, and this floor is going to give away any second now. Come on, everybody! Down the stairs and out of this house!" They ran, stumbling down the stairs, and look, there's them all running out the house. Look, see? All running out the house before the floor caves in. Tinker was everywhere, under their feet, in front of one minute, behind the next, barking with excitement. Down they went. First to the top landing, then down the main stairs, one flight, another flight, and all the time they could hear the attic floor groaning with the enormous weight that was resting on it. As they reached the hall at the front of the foot of the stairs, a piece of plaster from the ceiling high above them crashed to the floor, shattering over the filthy carpet. "Out, everybody, out!" screamed Kip. Frank wrenched open the front door and they all piled out of the house and onto the road, with Tinker dancing among them. When they had reached the relative safety of the opposite pavement, they all turned and looked backwards towards the house. For a moment, everything appeared to be normal. Or as normal as the grim house could ever look, with its soot-encrusted walls and its tall finger-like chimneys and its black-painted windows. And then, with a thunderous crash, the attic floor gave way, and the great stone block with the two statues on top began to fall through the house. It hit the floor beneath the attic with the sound of a bomb going off. And that floor gave way instantly, and the block continued on its way, smashing through the floor below, then on through the floor below that, and finally ripping its way down to the street level, where it landed on the filthy carpet with an ear-splitting thump. And then the grim house did something very odd. It sighed. They could all hear it clearly. A great big sad exhalation of breath, as if it had lost the will to go on standing. The chimneys were the first to go. Slowly, one toppled, then another, and then another. The sooty bricks crashed through the black slate roof. The roof shuddered and then collapsed inwards and downwards, ripping its way through what was left of the floors. The walls were last, slowly at first. They started to crumble, falling in on themselves with increasing speed until, with a roar, the whole building disappeared in a great cloud of black dust. The dust blew over them. It smelt of dead fish, old mattresses, and the insides of ancient sneakers. Everybody held their noses until the dust cloud settled. Everybody except Tinker, who couldn't hold his nose, and even if he'd been able to, wouldn't. To Tinker, there were no really bad smells, just interesting ones. Where the house had stood was a huge pile of black rubble. In the middle of the rubble stood the statue. The stone base was buried in the fallen bricks and roof slates, but the two figures of the man and the woman stood clear above the wreckage. Measle, his throat dry from the dust, croaked. "What happened?" William began to say, "Beats me," but he only got as far as "beats" before Kip suddenly grabbed his arm and pointed at the statue. The outer stone of the two figures was beginning to crack like an eggshell. A large chunk fell off the man's head, followed by another from the woman's outstretched arms. More and more cracks appeared on the figures, and more of the stone covering fell away, revealing to everybody's astonished eyes the shapes of a real man and a real woman underneath. Who could this be? Suddenly, the man shook himself, and the last of the stone fell away from his body. He reached down and began picking the remaining pieces from the woman's body until both were free. Then he held out his hand, and the woman took it. He lifted her from her knees, and they clung to each other for a moment. Then they both turned and looked towards the group of people on the other side of the street. They smiled. The man, still holding tight to the woman's hand, stepped down onto the rubble, and together they picked their way over the ruins, walking through across the road. When they reached the group, they stood first in front of Frank. The man let go of the woman's hand and took Frank's instead. He shook it and said, "Thank you." The woman reached up and kissed Frank on the cheek, and she said, "Thank you, too." They went to each person in turn, the man shaking hands, the woman kissing cheeks, and when they got to Tinker, the man fondled the dog's ears, and the woman knelt down and hugged him hard, pressing her lips against his rough muzzle. They left Measle to last. He looked up at the man and the woman, who were standing quietly in front of him. There was something about them both, something he could almost, but not quite, put his finger on. They looked familiar in some way, as if he'd known them both a very long, long time ago. Old friends, perhaps, from a distant past. Very good old friends. The man was tall, with curly brown hair. His eyes were brown and they wrinkled at the corners when he smiled. And they were wrinkling now. The woman was slim, her reddish hair tumbling over her shoulders. Her eyes were green, with tiny flecks of gold in them. She was, Measle decided, very pretty. She was smiling too. Measle stuck out his hand. "Hi," he croaked. "I'm Measle Stubbs." "No, you're not," said the man. "Your name isn't Measle Stubbs. It's Sam Lee Stubbs. I'm your dad, and I should know." "And I'm your mum," said the woman, and Measle looked at her and saw that even though she was smiling as broadly as the man, she was crying. She wiped her hand across her eyes, sniffed and said, "And you need a bath." There were questions and explanations and more answers and a lot of hugging and kissing, and Measle found himself unable to say anything very much because his heart was thumping in his chest and he felt like crying, although he didn't know why. He just stood and stared and grinned at the man who was his father and the woman who was his mother. And between answers and explanations, his father and his mother stood and stared and grinned at him. At last, in a pause in the babble, he tugged at the man's sleeve and said, "Sam Lee?" "That's your name," said Mr. Stubbs. "The name we gave to you when you were born. It's a mixture of our names, your mother's and mine. I'm Sam Stubbs. Mum's name is Elizabeth, but everybody calls her Lee. The Wrathmonk called you Measle, because Wrathmonks like to muddle things up. He used all the same letters as Sam and Lee, but he mixed them around and came up with Measle. It was one of his many ways of trying to make you feel bad. And look, there's Measle and his mum and dad, finally reunited. Who'd have thought that they were the people that were in the statue? That's crazy." Measle thought for a moment. Then he said, "Well, it didn't work. I don't mind Measle. I've sort of got used to it." "Hey," said Sam Stubbs, "if you like being called Measle, then we'll call you Measle." "Thank you very much," said Measle. Something funny was happening to his eyes. They seemed to be watering quite badly, and he blinked hard to make the wetness go away. To change the subject, and because he really wanted to know, he said, "Basil told me, though, that you were killed by a deadly snake, and that wasn't true, was it?" Sam Stubbs raised one eyebrow. "You don't think so?" he said, a small smile turning up at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Basil never lied," said Measle. "At least, not as far as I know." Sam Stubbs nodded. "No, he never did. And he didn't lie about what happened to us either. Of course, there were a few things he left out of the story. Things like the snake just happened to belong to him, and far from being alive, it was very, very dead. And it wasn't even a complete snake, just an ancient mummified snake's head. An ancient mummified snake's head that once wriggled about on Medusa's skull." "Who?" said Measle. "Medusa, the Gorgon. Never heard of her?" Measle shook his head. Sam Stubbs turned to Lee Stubbs and muttered, "Not just a bath, dear, also an education." He turned back to Measle and grinned. "Well, son, Medusa was a very nasty monster who lived thousands of years ago. She was reasonably normal looking as far as monsters go, except for the fact that instead of hair, she had a whole lot of horrible snakes writhing about her head. I don't know how she ever got any sleep with all that wriggling and hissing. Anyway, if you just looked at Medusa, you turned to stone. One peep at her ghastly face and bang! You're granite. Anyway, to cut a long story a bit shorter... Oh, please don't, said Measle, who was rather enjoying the tale. Well, I'll give you the full version later. The important part is that Basil had somehow got hold of one of her mummified snake's heads, as you can imagine. They're pretty rare objects these days. And that's what he used on us, you see. Even dead and mummified and not even part of Medusa's scalp anymore, it still had a bit of power left. Not enough to petrify us all the way through, but just enough to give us a good thick covering of granite and stone. And all before we could say, "What's that in your hand, Basil?" So you see, he was sort of telling the truth all the time. Measle wanted to hear a lot more about gorgons and snakes and being turned to stone, but Mrs. Stubbs suddenly looked up at the sky and said, "It's getting late, dear. I do think we ought to be getting home." "Home," said Measle, hopefully. "Home," said Sam Stubbs. "It's a nice big house out in the country, lots of land, a couple of streams, a little lake. It should still be there. I mean, only houses like this one fall over just like that. Why don't we go and see?" Mrs. Stubbs had started to stroke Measle's head. Measle found that he rather liked his head being stroked. She bent down to him and said, "Come on, Measle, why don't we all go and see?" "Okay," said Measle, wondering if anybody else could hear the thumping of his heart. Sam Stubbs turned to the rest of the group. You all of you lost a lot of time in there. A few years out of your lives for a start. I'd like to help you out, if you'll let me. In the meantime, a few days of rest and relaxation won't do any of you any harm. So I want you all to come and stay with us for a while. There's plenty of room, and you'll stay as long as you like, until you get back on your feet." Lady Grant limped forward, holding her remaining shoe tight against her chest. "Speaking of feet, this is so kind of you, Mr. Stubbs. Unfortunately, as you can see, I've lost one of my precious Manilows. It's somewhere underneath all that revolting rubble, so I won't be able to walk very far." Sam Stubbs smiled. "Well, we shall have to do something about that, won't we? Just a moment." He turned away and took a couple of steps along the pavement, separating himself from the group. He seemed to be thinking for a moment. His forehead creased in a small frown. Then his face cleared and he smiled to himself. "Funny how quickly things come back to you," he muttered. He raised his head, closed his eyes, and said quite softly, "Catham stabrano malano carfax." "What did he say?" said William. A small, delighted scream from Lady Grant made everybody's head swivel in her direction. The Lady Grant, still clutching her right shoe, was staring down at her feet. Both were still bare, but right beside the big toe on her left foot stood a battered and dusty left-foot high-heeled black shoe. Sam Stubbs grinned at her and said, "A bit bashed about, I'm afraid, but at least it's no longer buried." "Oh dear," said Prudence in a nervous voice. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Come along, everybody. I think we ought to be going now. Right now, in fact." Lee Stubbs smiled around the group. "It's all right," she said. "He was just doing a little magic." Prudence smiled weakly. "That's what I'm afraid of, Mrs. Stubbs. I mean to say, with all due respect, what exactly is your husband?" "He's a wizard, Mrs. Pazer. That was half the trouble, you see." "Half the trouble?" "As far as Basil Tramplebone was concerned. But that's another story. Don't worry. My husband is a very minor wizard." "Oh dear. But surely you'd rather keep that a secret. I mean, we ordinary mortals aren't really supposed to know about he's a wizard. Isn't that so, Mr. Stubbs?" "Well," said Lee confidently, "I think it's probably best that you don't know. I think it's best that you probably do know. After all, you've been through so much, all of you. And you've known a Wrathmonk, for goodness sake. What's a minor wizard after that? And he's very nice, honestly, he is. He wouldn't hurt a fly. Unless, of course," and here Lee Stubbs lowered her voice to a whisper, "unless, of course, the fly happened to be a Wrathmonk." Lee Stubbs smiled a little, secretive sort of smile at Prudence. It was the kind of smile that said, "You know what I'm talking about, don't you?" Then she looked around and frowned in disgust. "And now, let's get away from this horrible place as quickly as possibly as we can." Nobody said no, which was hardly surprising. The only remark spoken at all during the next few moments was by Prudence Pacer. She whispered into Lady Grant's ear, "Minor wizard, indeed. I don't think so, Lady Grant. Rather major, I would say." "Really?" said Lady Grant, beaming with the prospect of mixing with members of the mystical elite. She detached herself from Prudence, put on her most winning smile, and made a beeline for Mr. and Mrs. Stubbs. But before she could say a single flattering thing to them, Lee Stubbs had taken one of Measle's hands, and Sam Stubbs had taken the other, and the three of them led the small group down and out of the dismal street forever. When everybody had gone, and the street was once again deserted, the small black cloud floated over the rubble, looking for something to rain on. Off to one side, at the edge of the ruined house, were two patches of green slime, one very small, the other quite large. There was something about those two patches of green slime that felt right to the small black cloud, so it positioned itself directly above them and began to release its rain. The rain fell heavily, and quite soon the two patches of slime began to dissolve, mixing with the black dust and the water into a soupy puddle. Soon the puddle slipped into the gutter at the side of the road, slipped silently down at the slight slope, and meeting a drain set into the channel, gurgled down and into the darkness of the sewers. And the small black cloud squeezed the very last of the water out of itself, and then, with nothing left to rain on, popped, with the sound of a cork being pulled from a bottle, out of existence. And look, there's it going, pop! And what do you do? That's it. That's the book. That's Measle and the Wrathmonk by Ian Ogilvy, illustrated by Chris Mould and published by Oxford University Press. I have loved reading this book for you guys. It is one of my favourite stories. When everybody was too busy going on about Harry Potter and all that kind of stuff, I was too busy reading these. I loved these stories. These were like right up my alley, and the fact that they had these wonderful illustrations by Chris Mould. I mean, I don't think you've ever actually had a good proper... I mean, look at that. That's just crazy to me, man. Just this the details. I mean, even just the train from one of the earlier chapters. I think this was chapter 2. I mean, look at that. Such a lovely drawing, and the fact that it kind of cuts right across the page, and it's just littered through the kind of the book. It's wonderful. Just so nice, so nice. And look, there's the giant cockroach there. Look, trying to get its way into the town hall. Oh. There we go. The town hall. These were just beautiful books to me, and I just loved these stories so much. This is the first in a line of 5 books. Yeah. So you've got Measle and the Wrathmonk, which is the first story, and if I quickly get bear with me a moment. These are the other books. These are all first editions because they've got this colourful kind of vinyl coating on them. But you've got the second book, which is a much bigger book, as you can see. That's thicker. This is Measle and the Dragodon. Then you have Measle and the Malachy. You have Measle and the Slitherghoul. And then you have Measle and the Doom Pit. So those were the books that kind of came out. Measle and the Doom Pit was the last one to come out. Since then there hasn't been any others since. I don't know if they were ever planning on making more or what, I don't know, but I always just kind of always hoped that they would bring out another one, to be fair. But yeah, just wonderful, wonderful stories. Yeah, just these books just made my childhood. I loved these. I used to actually sit and copy the drawings as well, like just because I love these stories so much. But just, you know, yeah, so if you've enjoyed this, I really hope you did, because I loved these books, and it's hopefully inspired you to go out and find your own copies of these books, both this and the other ones, and just kind of acquaint yourselves with the other stories, because these other stories are fantastic. So if you like this, go obviously get this one as well as the other ones by Ian Ogilvy, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Stay home, stay safe, protect the NHS, save lives, and thank you very much for joining me on this wonderful book and allowing me to share this with you guys. In the meantime, Bye bye just now.